I want to tell you about a door, not a metaphorical door, not a door in some ancient text described by a monk in marginal handwriting, translated 3 times and disputed by academics. A physical door, iron, Setinto stone. In the basement of a building that, according to every official record, was constructed in 1887. The door was welded shut, and behind the wall next to it, the wall that should, by any architectural logic, have led somewhere, was solid concrete. Poured concrete. The kind of pour that doesn't happen by accident, that doesn't happen because someone ran out of space, the kind that happens because someone made a decision, a deliberate, coordinated, final decision. That's where this started for me. Not with a theory, not with a book, with a welded door and a wall of concrete in a basement that wasn't supposed to have a basement. I've spent the better part of 3 years looking at buildings, old buildings, buildings that historians date to the latter half of the 19th century, the 1850s, the 1860s, the 1880s, buildings that appear almost overnight in cities across multiple continents, grand civic structures, ornate train stations, city halls and customs houses, and exhibition palaces with ceilings so high they seem designed for a different kind of person, or a different kind of purpose. And almost everywhere I've looked, the deeper I looked, there's a lower level. Not always accessible. In fact, almost never accessible. Sometimes bricked over, sometimes flooded deliberately, with municipal water systems that seem almost too conveniently routed through spaces that might otherwise invite exploration. Sometimes, most interestingly, filled, poured solid with concrete. The question that started haunting me wasn't what's down there. That question, while important, assumes we might eventually find out. No, the question that started keeping me up at night was simpler and more disturbing. Why does the ceiling happen at the same time? I need you to sit with that for a moment. We're told that these buildings were constructed during a great wave of civic development. The official narrative, the one you find in architecture textbooks, in municipal histories, in the beautifully typeset pamphlets distributed by heritage preservation societies, tells a coherent story. Cities grew, populations expanded, enlightened governments and ambitious industrialists built magnificent public structures. Progress. That's the story. But here's what the story doesn't explain. Why, across dozens of cities, on multiple continents in the early 1920s, with particular concentration around 1922 and 1923, there is a sudden coordinated effort to seal, fill, or permanently close the lower levels of structures that had been, until that point, at least partially accessible. Not renovated, not repurposed, sealed. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Let me be careful here, because this is where the skeptic in me wants to pump the brakes. Let me tell you what I can point to, what I can photograph, what I can hold in my hands. In city after city, if you look at municipal engineering records from the period between 1918 and 1930, you find allocations, line items in public works budgets for what are described almost uniformly as foundation stabilization projects, or sub-basement remediation, or, my personal favorite, infrastructural normalization. Infrastructural normalization. What does that mean? I've asked architects, I've asked civil engineers, I've asked historians of public works. The answers range from vague to contradictory. One engineer, a very patient man in a small university office, told me it likely referred to the process of bringing older foundations up to modern load-bearing standards. Perfectly reasonable. Except when you look at the quantities of concrete involved, the math stops making sense. You don't need to fill a space solid to stabilize it. In fact, structural engineers will tell you the opposite, that a well-constructed void, properly reinforced at its edges, is often more structurally sound than an indiscriminate pour. Filling a large underground space with concrete serves one primary function above all others. It makes that space permanently inaccessible. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to take a moment here because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, old buildings have basements. Basements sometimes need to be decommissioned. This is a mundane infrastructural reality. And you're right that that explanation exists. I'm not dismissing it. I'm asking whether it's sufficient. Because here's the thing about sufficient explanations. They need to explain everything. Not most of it. Everything. And this one, the mundane infrastructural reality explanation, collapses the moment you start asking about the documentation. Where are the engineering surveys that would have preceded these fills? You don't pour thousands of cubic yards of concrete into underground structures without first documenting what you're pouring it into. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's basic professional practice. Every significant construction project generates paperwork, surveys, photographs, structural assessments, reports to municipal authorities, invoices from concrete suppliers that would specify not just quantities but delivery locations and purposes. For the vast majority of these foundation stabilization projects, those records are either absent, incomplete, or, and this is what interests me most, suspiciously uniform. Almost as though they were generated from a template. Almost as though someone sat down and decided that all of these projects across all of these cities should be described in exactly the same way. The official explanation begins to collapse here. I want to walk you through what I mean by a world-spanning pattern, because I think the scale of it is what the official history cannot account for. Think about the great railway stations built in the mid to late 19th century. Think about how many of them share not just an architectural style, but specific proportions, specific ornamental vocabularies, specific relationships between public space and subterranean space. The vaulted ceiling held at a particular height, the columns spaced at particular intervals, the platform set at a particular depth below grade. The deeper I went into the architectural literature, the stranger this uniformity became. We're told this represents the international spread of Beaux-Arts design principles. Students travelled, pattern books circulated, architects corresponded across borders. This is the official explanation, and it is, on its surface, not unreasonable. But there's a problem. The problem is the timing. The problem is that you don't just import a design philosophy, you import specific measurements, specific structural choices that go far beyond aesthetic preference and into something that looks more and more as you examine it like a pre-existing system being adapted rather than a new system being invented. This raises a simple but critical question. What were these buildings built on top of? Not built near, not built adjacent to, built on top of. The evidence suggests something much larger, a pre-existing network of subterranean infrastructure that the buildings of the 19th century didn't create, but rather occupied, incorporated, used as foundations, as utility corridors, as spaces whose function by the time of the building boom was either unknown to the builders or deliberately obscured. And then, in the early 1920s, sealed. Why the 1920s specifically? I've asked this question to everyone I can find who might have a credible answer. The most common response that this period saw widespread modernization of urban infrastructure is true, but incomplete. Yes, cities were modernizing. Yes, plumbing and electrical systems were being expanded, but modernization doesn't require the permanent entombment of what came before. It never has in any other era of construction, unless what came before was something you needed to be permanently inaccessible. Here's the strangest part. When you find access to the portions of these lower levels that weren't filled, the sections that were simply sealed, bricked over, gated or flooded but not buried in concrete. When you find photographs or the rare first-hand account from a municipal worker or urban explorer who managed to get inside before the final closures, what you find is not what you'd expect from a 19th century construction project. The stonework is different. Not everywhere, and not in every structure, but with a frequency that is, I would argue, impossible to dismiss as coincidence, you find masonry in the lower levels that doesn't match the masonry of the levels above. Different cutting techniques, different stone types, and, this is the detail that I keep returning to, a precision of fitting that is, by any honest assessment, difficult to attribute to the tools and methods that the official historical record says were available at the time of the structure's supposed construction. The joints are too tight, the angles are too true. The stones are shaped in ways that serve structural purposes far beyond decorative need. Who built these lower levels? When? With what tools? Under whose direction? The silence is deafening. I want to be precise about what I'm not claiming. I'm not claiming that there was a specific civilization with specific borders and a specific government that built a world-spanning network of underground infrastructure. I'm not in a position to make that claim, and frankly, anyone who tells you they can make that claim with certainty is selling you something. What I am pointing to is a pattern of anomalies, things that don't fit. Things that the official story, the story of a 19th century construction boom driven by industrial era technologies and European design philosophy, cannot coherently account for. Not one anomaly, not two, dozens, hundreds, distributed across continents, repeating with a consistency that demands an explanation, while the means to investigate have been systematically and permanently removed. And here's where I want to spend some time, because I think this is the most intellectually honest way to approach what we're dealing with, even if you accept every piece of the official narrative, the construction timeline, the architectural lineage, the mundane infrastructural explanations. You are still left with what I would call the coordination problem. The sealing events of the early 1920s required coordination. C'est a coordination across international borders, across competing political systems, across the jurisdictions of dozens of cities in multiple countries, all arriving at the same solution, permanent concrete fill, within the same approximate window of time. How do you explain that with the spread of a new construction technique? But there was nothing new about poured concrete. It had been in widespread use for decades, with a sudden universal recognition of structural problems in existing foundations, but that would require a worldwide engineering consensus of a specificity and urgency that has no parallel in any other period of construction history. With coordinated municipal reform movements. These existed, yes, but they addressed sanitation, transportation, housing. Not with any documented emphasis the permanent sealing of underground spaces. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, and the official explanation breaks here, not because it's obviously wrong, but because it's obviously insufficient. Something coordinated this. Something with reach across national boundaries, with authority over municipal engineering departments, with access to resources on a scale that the surviving records dramatically underrepresent. What was it? I don't know. I genuinely don't know, and I think the honest answer to that question is that the means of knowing were among the things that were sealed away. This raises a simple but critical question. Is it possible that what was being sealed wasn't just physical space, but legibility itself? The ability of future generations to look back, to dig down, to read the material record of the world that existed before the world we were handed. Let me tell you about photographs. The 19th century was famously the great age of photography. The camera arrived and people used it compulsively, obsessively, to document everything. Streets, families, disasters, construction projects. There are thousands of photographs of the great civic building projects and of the 1850s through 1890s, the exteriors going up, the workers posing on scaffolding, the dedication ceremonies. Almost no photographs of the excavation. Think about that. In an era when photographers were documenting everything, when you can find photographs of specific city streets taken in 1868, of specific factories in 1877, of specific railway platforms in 1881. The excavation and construction of the sub-levels of these grand civic structures is almost entirely undocumented, photographically, not underdocumented, almost entirely undocumented. Why? What was there to hide from a camera during the excavation phase that wasn't there to hide during the construction of the facade? The deeper I looked at the photographic record, the more conspicuous the absence became. Absences are evidence, not conclusive evidence, but evidence. And then there are the workers. Every major construction project of the 19th century has labour records, payroll records, union records, contemporary newspaper coverage of disputes and accidents, and completion milestones. The great railway stations, the city halls, the exhibition palaces, these have all of this. Except for the sub-levels. When the workers who would have built or modified these lower spaces appear in the record at all, they appear without the specificity you'd expect. Without the detail. Names sometimes in aggregate payroll entries, but rarely with the kind of biographical trace that workers on the above-grade portions of the same projects left behind, as though they were managed separately, kept separate, as though whoever was directing the work didn't want a clear accounting of who had been underground and what they had seen. The evidence suggests something much larger than any individual construction project. Something that required operational discretion even at the time it was happening. Here's a detail that doesn't get enough attention. Many of these structures, the train stations especially, but also certain city halls and customs buildings, are dramatically overbuilt relative to the loads they were ever intended to carry. Their foundations are deeper than they need to be. Their subterranean footings extend further and are composed of more material than any engineer of the period would have specified for the structural needs of the building above. The official explanation is that 19th century engineers, lacking precise load calculations, simply built conservatively, overbuilt as a safety margin. This is plausible for some structures, but for structures where the overbuilding follows specific patterns, where the excess foundation depth almost exactly corresponds to the depth of the filled or sealed lower levels, the safety margin explanation becomes harder to maintain. Because a safety margin doesn't have rooms, a safety margin doesn't have corridors, a safety margin doesn't have the precisely cut stone and the too tight joints that keep appearing in the sections that weren't built by the 19th century contractors at all. Something was already there, and the construction crews of the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s, whether they knew it or not, whether they were told or not, built on top of it and around it and eventually over it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to talk about what we mean when we say history. We tend to think of history as something that was passively recorded, events that happened and then were written down by witnesses, preserved in archives, eventually organised by scholars into a coherent narrative, a neutral process of accumulation. But history is also a selection, a decision made by someone about what to keep and what to discard, what to highlight and what to minimise, what to explain and what to quietly set aside. Every archive is also a set of absences. Every official record is also everything that didn't make it into the official record. The question isn't whether historical erasure happens. It does. Everyone who's ever studied history at a serious level knows this. The question is, when we find a pattern of erasure, a specific geographically distributed, temporally concentrated pattern of erasure that corresponds to the sealing of specific types of physical spaces, are we looking at coincidence or are we looking at intention? I can't answer that. The means of answering it were poured over with concrete in 1923. And here's the question that I keep circling back to, the one that haunts me most on the nights when I'm going through old engineering records and finding, again, another line item for sub-foundation normalization, in a city that shouldn't need it, in a building that shouldn't require it, at a cost that doesn't match any plausible scope of work. What exactly was worth protecting? I don't mean protecting from us. I don't mean protecting from posterity. I mean, what was in the early 1920s sufficiently threatening or sufficiently valuable that it justified the resources, the coordination, the deliberate obscuring of a physical record that had, until that point, simply existed. Not a theory, not a document, a physical record. Stone and masonry and the silent geometry of spaces built by hands, that history, as we have received it, does not account for. The official explanation that this was mundane urban modernization requires us to believe that the people overseeing these projects thought so little of what they were sealing that they didn't bother to document it, didn't bother to photograph it, didn't bother to take even a cursory archaeological record before pouring the concrete. Does that strike you as plausible, or does it strike you as exactly what you'd do if the thing you were sealing was something you needed the future to have no clear evidence of? I started with a door, iron, welded shut, set into stone in the basement of a building that officially has no basement worth mentioning. 3 years later, I have more questions than I started with. I have photographs of anomalous stonework and missing engineering documents and concrete pours that don't make structural sense, and patterns of erasure that repeat with maddening consistency across a span of geography that no single organization should have been able to coordinate. I have the silence of archives that should be speaking. I have the concrete that replaced what should have been evidence. And I have this thought, which I'll leave you with because I don't have a conclusion. I have a question. If an earlier world, a world with capabilities and reach, and built forms that don't fit the history we've been given, if that world left its traces in the ground beneath our cities, and if those traces were systematically, deliberately, permanently buried in a single concentrated period of time, then we are not living in ignorance of history by accident. We are living in ignorance of history by design. And the question is not whether we can still find the traces, though some remain for now in the sections that weren't fully sealed, in the buildings where the concrete pour stopped 3 feet short of everything, in the photographs that weren't quite suppressed and the documents that weren't quite destroyed. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is whether we are willing to take seriously what it suggests. Because once you look at the pattern, once you really look at it, the timing, the coordination, the uniformity of method, the systematic absence of documentation, you cannot look away and return to comfortable certainty. Not quite. Not ever. Completely.